Picture this. You're standing beneath the towering arches of Topkapi Palace, where the stone breathes heat from the sun and the tiled mosaics shimmer like the inside of a jewel box. The air is rich with the scent of roses from the courtyard gardens, sweet and suffocating, like perfume on a corpse. You hear the wind stir through the cypress trees outside, the gentle splash of a fountain, and for a moment, all is serene. And then, you hear it. A scream. High-pitched, cracked, barely human. Not the scream of a grown man in pain. No, it's younger, smaller. A voice still climbing toward adolescence, but arrested, frozen in a kind of limbo no child should ever know. It echoes down the marble halls, bouncing off the gold leaf calligraphy and silken drapery like a mockingbird. You're not supposed to hear it. This is a palace after all, a museum now. Tourists take selfies near the imperial chamber. Children eat ice cream on benches where sultans once plotted executions. But in some rooms, the sound lingers. Not every ghost is seen. The scream belongs to a boy. He isn't being punished. He isn't a criminal. He's being prepared for dinner. Not as dinner, but for it. He will not be seated at the table. He will be brought out to the table, dressed in silver thread, painted like a doll, drugged if necessary. He will dance. He will crawl. He will sing, or pretend to sing, depending on what they've taken from him. He is one of hundreds. In the time of Sultan Murad IV, the Ottoman Empire ruled with unimaginable wealth and terror. Its palaces were temples of marble and velvet, lit by candlelight and soaked in the blood of the unseen. Murad reigned from the age of 11, though for years his mother, Kösem Sultan, held the real power. And when he finally took full control, he did so with a fury that history still whispers about. He outlawed tobacco, alcohol, and coffee. He roamed the streets in disguise, executing violators with his own hands. He was a creature of contradictions, obsessed with order and drunk nearly every night. A military genius and a man broken by paranoia. But perhaps his most grotesque legacy lived not on the battlefield, but in the chambers of his own palace, in the shrines of silence he created from boys' bodies. These boys came from everywhere: Armenia, Greece, Hungary, Bosnia, taken during raids or sold by desperate families. Some were gifted by governors trying to earn favor. Bright eyes, clear skin, beauty above all. They were brought in like treasures, stripped, bathed, examined, and then they were cut. Castration, in theory, ensured their loyalty. It removed the possibility of sexual competition within the palace. It made them safe to work near the sultan's women. But Murad had no interest in such practicalities. He used the eunuch system like an artist uses paint. Only his canvas was humiliation. Some of the boys were completely castrated. Others were only partially. It depended on what the handlers thought the sultan might prefer. There were no anesthetics, no antiseptics, just a blade, some cloth, and the knowledge that most wouldn't survive. Those who did were changed forever. They did not grow. Their voices stayed high and soft. Their faces stayed childlike. They became living dolls, the harem of boys. And Murad used them not as servants, but as playthings. When foreign dignitaries visited the palace, the feasts were spectacles of depravity. Lavish spreads of lamb, pomegranate, and sherbet wine covered tables that stretched the length of courtyards. Musicians played hypnotic rhythms while concubines lounged in gauze-thin silks. And when the plates were cleared, the real show began. The boys were led out like dancers at a carnival. Some wore masks, some wore nothing. They bowed and twirled and crawled on hands and knees, mimicking animals. Guests laughed. Some averted their eyes. A few made quiet prayers to their own gods under their breath, but no one stopped it. Murad watched from a raised dais, his face expressionless. Occasionally, he clapped. More often, he drank. When he was in a mood, he'd give commands mid-performance, have a boy whipped for looking up too soon, or throw gold coins at one who cried prettily. To the Sultan, cruelty was performance. Humiliation was art. There are stories, quiet, trembling stories, of what happened after the guests left, of boys selected to stay behind, of nights that vanished from memory in a haze of wine and blood. But most stories were buried with the victims. After all, eunuchs had no families to mourn them, no last names to be etched on a tomb. They died the way they lived, in silence. Some grew older and remained in the palace. A few rose in rank. The chief black eunuch became one of the most powerful men in the empire, but even he had once been a boy with a voice that screamed in the marble halls. The rest were discarded, sent to lesser posts, forgotten. Their youth, once a currency of entertainment, now a useless shell. There are records of some ending their lives in bathhouses. Others simply vanished, swallowed by time. Today, we call it a palace. We praise its domes and tiles, its golden gates and latticework windows. But for some, it was a prison sculpted from opulence, a place where boys were brought to be broken, their suffering sweetened with rosewater and silks. And Murad? He died at 27. Liver failure. Alone in a room with no light. The very things he banned, alcohol, indulgence, became the tools of his undoing. The empire mourned him as a strong ruler, a restorer of order, a man of vision. But the boys did not mourn. They had no voice left to offer. So now, as you stand in the cool hush of Topkapai's stone corridors, and the sun bleeds through stained glass above the old imperial bedroom, if you hear something, a distant wail, a quick, panicked breath, a sound that doesn't belong, it's not your mind playing tricks. It's just one of the boys still screaming, still waiting for someone to notice. And in that moment, maybe the walls finally speak. Not in words, but in the echo of everything they were built to hide. Because behind every empire polished in gold, there is always blood in the grout. The boy was never meant to be remembered. He had a name once, given by a mother who kissed his forehead and sang to him beneath olive trees. But that name, that soft sound of identity, was stripped from him long before the blade ever touched his skin. In the eyes of the men who took him, he was not a child. He was not a soul. He was a commodity, measured not by character, but by symmetry, by smooth skin, by the shape of his jaw and the brightness of his eyes. They came in the dark. Ottoman raiders, sweeping through distant Christian villages like shadows with swords. The children they took were the ones who didn't cry too loud, the ones who didn't run fast enough, the ones whose parents were too old or too poor to fight. And sometimes, most grotesquely of all, the children were handed over willingly as tribute, as bargains for peace. From Armenia, from Greece, from the Balkans, they came in waves, shackled, silent, eyes darting through the bars of iron carts. Some were barely old enough to understand what was happening. Others had seen too much already, watched their fathers beaten, their mothers stripped of dignity. But in each face was a flicker of something even the slavers couldn't fully destroy: hope. Because no matter how cruel the journey, there was always the lie waiting at the end of it. The lie of the palace. The journey to Constantinople could take weeks. Crammed into the bellies of ships, the boys breathed in the stench of salt and sweat, vomit and fear. Some tried to escape by throwing themselves into the sea. Some succeeded, most did not. When they arrived, they were herded like livestock into holding pens near the imperial walls, cleaned, examined, fed just enough to keep them alive. No one spoke to them kindly. No one explained what would come next. But then, the gates of Topkapi opened. It looked like heaven. Gleaming courtyards, fountains carved like lace, servants in crisp white robes bowing low, music drifting through the trees, the scent of lemons and rose petals and honey. And when the boys entered, they were told, "You are safe now, you are lucky." Some of them even believed it. They were bathed again, scrubbed until their skin blistered. Their hair was cut short and their nails trimmed. They were weighed and measured, their posture adjusted, their diets changed. They were given silk garments, sandals, a mattress, a place to sleep. It all felt better, a strange kind of comfort wrapped in ceremony. And then came the physicians. Dressed in layers of white and gold, they moved like priests. Their hands were soft, perfumed, calm. They spoke in hushed voices. One boy was led into a room, then another, and then the screaming began. There was no anesthesia, no understanding of pain beyond its use as a tool. The doctors worked quickly, efficiently. The boys were tied down to marble slabs, some so small their arms didn't reach the restraints. The blade was shaped like a crescent. The cuts were precise, the bleeding endless. Some didn't make it past the table. They bled out on the floor, their small bodies convulsing, their eyes wide with shock. Others survived only to fall into fever for days, their minds lost to the agony. And in the corridors outside the surgical rooms, the rest waited, trembling, listening to every muffled cry, every choked gasp, knowing they were next. No one held them. No one comforted them. They were not boys anymore. They were inventory. Those who lived were taken to the recovery halls, long, cool chambers with rows of cots and high vaulted ceilings. They were fed broth through trembling lips. They were not allowed to speak. Some woke up screaming. Some didn't wake up at all. When their wounds closed, when their fevers broke, they were changed, not just in body, but in being. Puberty never came. Their voices remained soft, their bones narrow. They would never grow hair, never feel desire, never become men. And slowly, the name they were born with faded, even in their own minds. They were given new names, palace names, names that meant nothing, just syllables used by overseers to track obedience. They were given new clothes, new routines. They learned to bow, to sing, to serve sherbet, and adjust pillows. But some were selected for a different path, the performance path. These were the ones whose beauty lingered, the ones with long lashes, delicate limbs, and sadness in their eyes. They were trained like dancers, made to smile on command, to bend without breaking. Their worth was no longer in their bodies, but in how much pain they could conceal while pretending to entertain. They were brought to Murad's private halls, prepared with scented oils, powdered, dressed in embroidered robes that barely clung to their frames. And as they were led toward the banquet chamber, they saw their own reflection in the polished gold of the serving trays. A stranger, a porcelain doll, a puppet strung up by silence. They were told to dance. They were told to smile. They were told that their pain was a gift to the empire. And above them, on a platform draped in velvet, sat the man who had ordered it all. Sultan Murad IV, young, beautiful, empty-eyed. He watched them not with cruelty, but with curiosity, as if their suffering was not real, but a performance meant only for his amusement. Sometimes he laughed, sometimes he said nothing at all. Sometimes he would point to one and nod. That boy would not return to the dormitories that night. And always, the others watched, knowing it could be them next. The boy was never meant to be remembered, his name lost, his story swallowed, his grave unmarked. But even so, he lived, he breathed, he bled, he screamed. And somewhere in these marble halls, his scream still echoes. It is difficult to understand what it meant to be cut, because the word castration feels distant, clinical. It disguises something unspeakable behind a wall of syllables. But for these boys, it was not a concept. It was the dividing line between their past and a future they never asked for. There were two types: full and partial. Partial meant the testicles were removed. Painful, disfiguring, but survivable. Full meant everything was taken. The penis amputated, the urethra redirected through a tiny slit beneath the base, a wound that rarely healed cleanly, a wound that would reopen again and again when they urinated, when they moved, when they cried in the dark. And yet the physical suffering was only the beginning. The surgeons, if they can be called that, were well practiced, but even their precision could not stop the deaths. Infections swept through the recovery halls like wildfire. Some boys developed sepsis within hours. Others bled out quietly, clutching their bellies, too weak to scream. There are records of survival rates from foreign observers. Only half lived through the operation. Half. Imagine the silence of a room where 50 children walk in and 25 never walk out again. Those who lived were not congratulated. There was no acknowledgement, no comfort. They woke up hollow. They were feverish, disoriented, limbs trembling like reeds. And when the pain dulled to a low throb, they were washed again, rubbed with perfumed oils to hide the rot. They were dressed in silk robes, gold thread catching the candlelight. Jewels were fastened around their necks and wrists like collars on an animal. Their hair was powdered and styled, their skin inspected for blemishes. They were not healed, they were repackaged. The transformation was complete. They were no longer boys, but not yet anything else. Time would pass around them. Their peers outside would age, deepen in voice, grow stronger, broader, more defined. But inside the palace, these children stayed small, soft, suspended. Their bodies froze in a prepubescent cage. They would never grow facial hair, never feel lust, never learn what it meant to become a man. The world they might have entered was locked behind a door their own blood had sealed. And it wasn't an accident. They were chosen because of it. Murad didn't want men. He wanted something else. Something that could neither threaten nor refuse. Something docile. Something pliable. Something ornamental. He wanted boys who would never grow old, never rise above him, never remind him of anything except that he was God in this palace, and they were his broken angels. And so the survivors were paraded in soft shoes through silk-covered corridors. Their voices never deepened. Their backs never broadened. Their eyes remained too large for their faces. When they laughed, which was rare, it always sounded a little too high, like glass being tapped with a fingernail. They were not boys anymore, but they were never allowed to be anything else. Some whispered to each other in the night, about home, about mothers, about voices they could no longer imitate. But the whispering would fade. Over time, even memory became dangerous. You could be punished for weeping. You could be whipped for asking your own name. And slowly, those final pieces of identity fell away. Some tried to fake masculinity in private, puffing their chests, mimicking the palace guards. But their bodies wouldn't obey. Their muscles refused to grow. Their hearts raced with exhaustion after the smallest act of resistance. The damage was irreversible, deliberate. It was not enough to take their manhood. The goal was to take all of them and leave behind something beautiful and useful and silent. They were taught how to carry trays, how to recite poems, how to fold themselves into pleasing shapes. Their pain was buried beneath gold embroidery and soft music. The palace hummed with indulgence, but beneath it ran a steady current of horror, a quiet, constant undertow pulling them further from themselves. Because fear was the only thing that grew. It filled the space left behind by everything else. It filled their lungs when they sang, their chests when they danced, their bellies when they bowed. It became the fuel that kept them alive. And yet, even then, some still hoped. Hoped to be seen, hoped to be spared. Hoped that maybe, just once, the Sultan would look at them with kindness. But kindness was not what the palace taught, and Murad Force had no use for boys who could still feel whole. The dormitory was silent, not with the quiet of sleep, or peace, or reverence, but the suffocating silence of something sacred twisted into something sick. The boys' dormitory sat deep in the heart of the palace, behind carved doors and soft curtains, away from the laughter of soldiers, away from the scent of roasted meats and wine. It was clean, immaculately so. The floors shined like mirrors. The sheets were washed in rose water. The walls were painted with calming motifs of vines and birds and stars. But it was a prison, a place where light touched everything except the truth. Each boy had a bed, a robe, a bowl for washing, a tiny window, too high to see out of. They slept in rows like dolls stored in their boxes, motionless, voiceless, contained. They were not allowed to speak to one another, not even in whispers. Any attempt at conversation could be punished with lashes, or worse, with transfer to a different wing, where the truly broken were sent. They could not look directly at guests, even by accident. They could not run. They could not sing unless instructed. They could not grow hair. Every month, attendants arrived with blades and razors and lie. The boys were made to sit naked while their scalps were scraped clean, their limbs inspected, their skin scrubbed raw. Hair meant age. Hair meant resistance. Hair meant manhood. And the palace was determined to erase every sign of it. They were bathed morning and night, their bodies rubbed with perfumed oils, their fingernails clipped, their eyelashes combed. Any blemish, bruise, or scar was documented. They were property, after all. Their condition had to be preserved, but they were not being prepared for labour or for servitude. They were being sculpted, trained, yes, but not to pour tea or fetch messages. They were not servants in the traditional sense. They were trained for one purpose, to entertain, and not with dignity, not with the joyful, skillful artistry that dancers and singers give freely. No, their performances were acts of submission, of humiliation, designed not to uplift, but to amuse the powerful. Each day they were woken before dawn. They were led, barefoot, through tiled corridors to rehearsal halls. And there, beneath vaulted ceilings, where frescoes of paradise stared down like indifferent gods, they learned how to move. Some were taught dances from faraway provinces, graceful, aching motions meant to mimic flight, longing, pain. Some were taught songs in languages they didn't understand. Their voices were coached to stay light, tremulous, fragile, like the last breath before a sob. They weren't permitted to show strength. Their beauty lay in their brokenness. Others were assigned more degrading roles. Not everyone was meant to be elegant. Some were told to crawl, to bark like dogs, to act like birds, flapping their arms, pecking at imaginary crumbs on the ground, to mew like kittens, to play at being babies, and the instructors, stern-faced men with clipped beards and cold hands, corrected them constantly. Lower, they'd say, slower. The he, of course, was Murad. Each performance was choreographed to the Sultan's mood. Was he drunk? Was he furious? Was he grieving a lost brother, or hungry for something new? The boys were made to adapt, to guess, to improvise their own degradation just to avoid punishment. Their lives were governed by the shifting winds of Murad's pleasure, and when they weren't rehearsing, they were being prepared. Their robes were changed depending on the time of day. They were not allowed to choose the colour. They were not allowed to refuse jewellery. Their makeup was applied by older eunuchs who no longer performed, but still remembered what it was to tremble under the Sultan's eye. Even their bodies were posed while they slept, arms folded, spines straight, mouths closed. They were handled like porcelain animals, their fragility mistaken for elegance. Their humanity was not erased, it was aestheticized. Their suffering became performance art for the empire's elite, and through it all, their eyes dimmed. One by one, the light went out, not in a sudden collapse, not in a scream, but like a candle burning itself to the wick. Quiet, slow, final. Their faces, once full of fear, became unreadable. Not because the fear had vanished, but because it had nowhere left to go. They became perfect, polished, hollow. The feasts were legendary. They began with spectacle, oceans of wine poured from jeweled decanters, steaming platters of lamb glazed in honey and cloves, trays stacked with candied fruits that glistened like gems. Music floated through the air like perfume, the soft clang of lutes and zithers weaving between the murmurs of velvet-draped guests. Firelight danced on the walls, catching in the gilded plates and polished blades of ceremonial daggers. The smell was intoxicating: roast meat, incense, sweat, and something sour beneath it all, something old, something spoiled. Sultan Murad IV sat above it all on a dais carved from ivory and mother of pearl, shrouded in silk so fine they seemed like smoke. His eyes were heavy with wine and boredom, scanning the room as though every guest, every dish, every finely crafted goblet had already failed to please him. And in truth they had. The food was never the point. These banquets were for power, for domination, for the theatre of cruelty masquerading as celebration. And the main course was not meat, it was control. Once the final silver trays were cleared, once the guests had eaten until they leaned back with wine-slicked lips and loosened belts, the candles were dimmed. The music quieted to a hush, and then, without fanfare, the boys were brought in. They came barefoot, moving like ghosts. Some wore thin, embroidered masks, delicate things that covered half a face in shimmering thread. Others wore nothing at all. Their small bodies shivered under the weight of 100 eyes. Every step was choreographed, every movement taught and retaught until it became second nature, not for beauty, but for submission. The guests leaned forward. The Sultan watched in silence. A boy was commanded to sing, a high, trembling song in a language he barely understood. Another was told to dance, the bells at his ankles tinkling like mock applause. A third was forced to crawl between the guests, serving them sweetmeats from a tray balanced on his back like an obedient animal. Laughter erupted, not at jokes, but at them. At the way one boy's voice cracked mid-song, revealing the ragged edges of his pain. At the way another stumbled on his turn, his eyes wide with terror, knowing that mistake might be his last. Some guests placed wagers, coins flicked onto the marble floor, on which boy would cry first, which one would collapse, which one would soil himself, and all the while, the Sultan drank. The boys obeyed. They always obeyed, because disobedience didn't mean punishment. It meant erasure, no spectacle, no second chance, just disappearance. One night, a boy failed to hold his balance during a performance. He was not seen again. The others were made to scrub the stones the next morning, where a faint dark stain had already dried. There was no art in what they did, and yet it was treated as such. The guests clapped politely, toasted to the Sultan's refined tastes. They whispered that they were witnessing something rare, something exquisite, but what they were watching was the annihilation of childhood, polished, choreographed, draped in gold, and still, beneath the silks and shadows, the boys trembled. They were not too young to understand shame. They were too young to understand why no one stopped it. To them, It felt like the world had agreed this was what they were for. That pain, when performed properly, became beautiful. That their bodies were instruments meant to be plucked and broken for the pleasure of others. And so, night after night, they returned to the firelight, to the laughter, to the betting and the jeers and the blood beneath the tablecloths. Their eyes became mirrors, reflecting not their own horror, but the sickness of those who watched. And the palace applauded, and the empire grew, and no one spoke of it outside these golden walls, because suffering, when gilded with luxury, becomes easy to ignore. And children, when stripped of voice and name, are easy to forget. He sat like a god carved from obsidian, motionless, unreadable, always watching. Murad IV, cloaked in velvet, the color of dried blood, his fingers heavy with rings, his breath sweet with wine and rot. From his throne, he saw everything. Every twitch of fear, every misplaced glance, every tremor in a boy's voice as he stumbled through a forced melody. He rarely spoke during the performances. He didn't need to. His silence was a language everyone around him understood. You exist because I allow it. And when he did speak, when that low, slurred voice finally rolled out from behind his teeth, it was not to praise, it was to command. Make that one fight, he might say, pointing lazily with the edge of his goblet, and the boy, slight and wide-eyed, would be shoved toward another. Two children, half-starved and trembling, forced to strike each other with open palms, then fists. Not for survival, not for anger, for entertainment, for dominance, for the amusement of a man who had never once in his life been told no. Or he would raise a hand, just a flick of his fingers, and a servant would drag a boy forward. Sing, Murad would whisper, not even looking at him. And if the boy's voice shook, if he missed a note, if he forgot a word, a snap of the Sultan's fingers, and silence. He might be beaten where he stood. He might be yanked away by guards, never to be seen again. Or worse, he might be told to keep going, to finish the song through sobs and blood and humiliation, while the guests watched with glazed eyes and clenched jaws, pretending it wasn't happening right in front of them. Some nights, the Sultan would become erratic. Wine poured faster than the servers could bring it. His laughter turned sharp, strange. He'd play little games, murmuring commands just loud enough for the room to hold its breath. Crawl, he'd say to a boy dressed in silver. And the child, without hesitation, would obey, because he knew what came next if he didn't. There were boys who refused. Always, there were a few. The ones who remembered their names too strongly. The ones who thought they could hold on to something private inside themselves. But defiance was not strength in the palace. It was a death sentence. Some were beaten, stripped, and starved until they broke. Others were made examples, publicly humiliated, slapped and kicked while guests sipped sherbet and turned away. And then there were those who were simply taken down to the cisterns beneath the palace, the dark, echoing belly of the empire, where cold water pooled in forgotten chambers and voices didn't carry. There, they were drowned, not quickly, not mercifully, held under by men who never flinched. Their final thrashes witnessed by no one but the stone. The Sultan never spoke of these disappearances. He didn't need to. The absence spoke for itself. Every time a boy was missing the next morning, the others knew. They dressed in silence. They rehearsed harder. They cried into their pillows only when the candles had been snuffed out. But it wasn't just fear that ruled them. It was randomness. Murad didn't follow a code. He could spare a boy for crying too beautifully. He could destroy one for smiling too confidently. There was no logic, no justice, no rhythm. And that, more than anything, was what kept the boys hollow. Because how do you protect yourself from chaos? How do you plan for the madness of a man who kills with a smile, and saves with a shrug. There was a night, a cold one, in early winter, when Murad ordered a performance in the garden. The boys danced barefoot in the frost. One slipped, fell, bloodied his knee. The guests looked away, uncomfortable. Murad clapped, not once, but slowly, mockingly. And then he did something unthinkable. He rose from his throne. He walked over, took the boy by the chin, and lifted his face. "Good," he said. And then he turned, sat down, and gestured for the next boy. They called him Mercurial, a visionary, a restorer of discipline in the empire. But behind the palace walls, he was something else entirely. He was a god of torment, a boy king turned monster, a man who discovered that power tasted sweetest when sprinkled with unpredictability, when it crushed not just the body, but the spirit. And so the boys danced and crawled and sang, not knowing whether the next performance would end in reward, in ruin, or in the silence of a watery grave. The whispers began at the edges of empire, soft, cautious, laced with euphemism. They were not shouted from rooftops or etched into official records. No, they were scribbled in the margins of private journals, wrapped in allegory, hidden behind the polite language of diplomacy. For to speak plainly of what happened in Murad IV's court was to risk not only scandal, but war. Some who dined at the Sultan's table, envoys, emissaries, wealthy merchants from Europe and Persia, left behind accounts that shimmered with admiration for the palace. They wrote of the architecture, the opulence, the lavish generosity of their host. But always, between the lines, the shadow crept in. Gentle, almost poetic names, softer than truth. But the implication was clear. The more one read, the more one saw the shape beneath the silk. Some letters never reached their destinations, intercepted, burned. Their authors warned or vanished. The Ottomans were not fools. They understood the power of perception, and they guarded the palace's secrets with more vigilance than its gates. Those who did speak too freely found themselves quietly removed from court, their privileges revoked, their reputations tarnished by rumors planted just convincingly enough to ruin them. The page was found in his coat after he drowned in a canal. Accident, they said. And so the stories were buried, tucked into allegory, myth, and dream. Some were passed as warnings, shared in hushed tones by traders and sailors. Tales of a ruler who fed beauty to the fire, of boys dressed in gold who cried without sound, of masked performances where laughter was forbidden, lest it summon punishment. The Ottoman court dismissed such rumors as foreign slander, fabrications by jealous rivals, and perhaps some of them were, but too many stories survived, from too many mouths, from too many places. He never named the palace. He didn't need to. A musician in Vienna, after spending time in Constantinople, composed a series of nocturnes, each one beginning with a single high note, sustained and trembling, like a child's scream caught in crystal. Even the Ottoman people, far from the palace walls, whispered. Servants who caught glimpses of trembling figures in courtyards late at night. Fishermen who saw guards tossing bundles into the Bosporus under cover of fog. Mothers who warned their sons to never look too handsome, too perfect, lest the wrong eyes find them. The palace was airtight, sealed in silence and polished to brilliance. But secrets do not rot quietly. They ferment, they leak. And though the names of the boys were never recorded, though their lives were never honored in ledgers or eulogies, the world did not forget them entirely. They lived on in fragments, in stifled journal entries, in half-burned letters, in dreams that woke men in cold sweats decades later, in nightmares where masked children danced by candlelight, their eyes wide, their voices lost, and the sound of laughter turned suddenly to screams. Even now, scholars debate the veracity of these accounts. They ask, Could a ruler so beloved by his generals, so praised for restoring order, truly be capable of such cruelty? And still, the records remain incomplete, because the palace made sure of that, because the eunuchs could not tell their stories, because the boys could not grow old to bear witness. But truth, like grief, finds its way, and it does not need names to haunt you. Those who survived childhood did not survive whole. They remained eunuchs for life, marked, stunted, unchanging. Their bodies never matured, their voices never deepened, and whatever future they might have imagined before, the knife was sealed behind them like a door with no handle. Even after the banquets ended, even after their limbs grew heavier and their beauty faded from usefulness, they remained, not as men, not as boys, just eunuchs. Some were promoted. A few, rare few, learned to climb the treacherous steps of palace hierarchy, becoming chamberlains, stewards, or in exceptional cases, chief black eunuch, the second most powerful figure in the imperial harem. These men wielded authority over concubines, guards, and finances. They whispered in the sultan's ear. They signed decrees. They smiled and bowed and ruled over younger versions of themselves with terrifying precision. But even they remained alone. Their chambers were lavish, but cold. Their food rich, but tasteless. They were feared, yes, but never loved. There were no children waiting at the edge of the bed. No wife to soften the years. No family name to carry forward. They were ghosts in embroidered robes, drifting through the palace halls like reminders of a cruelty everyone pretended to forget. Most did not rise. Most were discarded the moment their usefulness expired. Age was a curse in the palace. As soon as a boy grew too tall, too tired, too bruised from years of forced submission, he was moved, pushed quietly into service roles, scrubbing floors, preparing baths, trimming gardens no one walked through. A few became gatekeepers or scribes, bending over ledgers with aching joints and hollow eyes. And some simply withered in the back rooms of Topkapi. They were kept alive out of habit. They had no title, no assignment, no purpose. They wandered the servant halls like shadows, half remembered by the new boys who whispered rumors about what had once been done to them. They ate alone, slept alone, died alone. No grave bore their real names, no family claimed them, no prayer was said on their behalf. Even in death, they were tools. Some tried to make sense of it, to believe it had all meant something, that their pain had built an empire, that their suffering kept the machine running. But that kind of hope faded quickly in the bathhouses, where steam could no longer hide their scars, and where the silence pressed in too close. The bathhouses were supposed to be a comfort, a place of cleansing, of warmth. But for many eunuchs, they became the final room, the place where the years caught up, where the mirrors didn't lie, where the body, softened and bent by decades of servitude, finally admitted what the mind could no longer fight. It is said that some slit their wrists beneath the water, letting the warm blood mix with steam, slipping into death the way they'd once slipped into obedience. Quietly, obediently, unseen. One boy, once praised for the way he danced with lit candles balanced on his back, was found curled in a tiled corner, a towel over his face, a note clutched in his hand, and no one could remember his name. That was the lifelong sentence, not just survival, but being erased in real time, alive, but untethered from the world. No one outside the palace mourned them. No historian wrote their story. No monument bears their faces. They were meant to be invisible, but invisibility is not the same as peace. They were the bricks of the empire's foundation, soft bodies crushed beneath centuries of gold and conquest, and the palace, beautiful and gleaming, still stands on their bones. The empire did not stop. The gears kept turning, smooth, precise, gleaming with the oil of blood that had long since dried. The Ottoman machine, vast and hungry, devoured continents and crowned sultans, all while pretending that nothing had ever happened behind those ornate palace doors. Murad IV died young, just 27. Cirrhosis of the liver, they said. The very vices he outlawed in his people, tobacco, alcohol, had quietly destroyed him from within. But the cruelty he institutionalized did not die with him. It became tradition. The boys stopped dancing, perhaps, the laughter at their pain dulled to a whisper, but the blade remained. The system endured. Eunuchs still served, still walked the marble halls in silence, still poured wine they would never taste, still bowed to men who had taken everything from them. What Murad had done was not treated as atrocity. It was treated as precedent. His reign was remembered for discipline, strength, order, not the crushed bodies, not the screams in the harem dormitories, not the boys drowned beneath the palace floor. There was no reckoning, no confession, just silence, layered in silk and stone. Historians praised his military campaigns, his reform of the janissaries, his supposed piety. The boys, they vanished. They were not mentioned in the official annals, not named in court documents, not remembered by the empire they had once bled to amuse. Their existence was erased with surgical precision, just like their bodies had been. Even today, Topkapi Palace stands as a monument to Ottoman brilliance. Tourists wander its sunlit courtyards, admiring mosaics and weaponry, whispering about intrigue and harems with the thrill of exotic fantasy. But they do not see the ghosts. They do not hear the echoes. They do not ask why so many rooms were locked, why so many names are missing from the records. Because forgetting was not a mistake, it was policy. The silence was engineered, curated like art, embedded in architecture, enshrined in every carefully chosen word that left the mouths of chroniclers and court poets. To speak of the boys would have been to stain the empire's image. To admit their pain would have been to tarnish the gold. So they were buried without earth, unremembered, ungrieved, unwritten. The eunuchs who survived learned not only how to serve, but how to disappear, how to swallow their histories whole, how to speak only when spoken to, how to look at the floor and not the faces of those who crushed them, and those who followed Murad, his brothers, nephews, sons. They continued the practice, quietly, efficiently, a few changes here and there, but the foundations remained, because cruelty, once normalized, becomes invisible, and silence, once taught, becomes sacred. There are no monuments to the boys, no names carved into stone, no flowers laid at any grave, just empty corridors, and the sound of sandals on polished tile, and the weight of 1,000 unheard voices, pressing down on history like a forgotten hymn. Topkapi Palace stands proud today, drenched in sunlight, its minarets sharp against the blue Istanbul sky. The gardens are lush, the fountains still murmur, and tour groups shuffle across polished tiles with cameras slung around their necks, murmuring about sultans and jewels and the mysteries of the harem. The marble glows white. The gold still catches the light just right. There are signs everywhere, plaques, guides, audio tours explaining the brilliance of Ottoman architecture, the military genius of the sultans, the artistry of calligraphy and court music. You'll hear about conquests and treaties. You'll hear about concubines and intrigue. You'll hear about the rose gardens where powerful women once walked, and the throne rooms where history was written with ink and steel. But you will not hear about the boys. Their rooms have no names. Their halls are unmarked. Their pain has been wiped clean, replaced with stories palatable for public consumption. No plaques mention the eunuch dormitories, No guide pauses to explain why certain courtyards feel too quiet, why some rooms echo more than others. No one asks why some tiles seem darker, worn down not just by feet but by knees, why certain drains in the stone are deeper than they should be. Because forgetting has become part of the ritual. But if you slip away from the crowd, just for a moment, step into one of the quieter wings of the palace, past the sunlit halls, into the older parts where the windows are fewer and the air is still. Find the place where the candles used to flicker against painted ceilings, where the breath of dancers once fogged the cold marble, and stand very, very still. Close your eyes, you might hear it. Not loud, not theatrical, just a sound. Thin, fragile, the final edge of a scream, not like in the stories, not like in nightmares, but a human sound. Real, small, cracked down the middle like porcelain. It lingers, not because a ghost remains, but because memory does. Because memory never needed permission to haunt a place. Because the walls that watched can't forget what they were forced to hold. The scream is not for attention. It is not for justice. It is simply what remains when a child's body breaks under the weight of centuries. And maybe you'll brush it off. Maybe you'll tell yourself it's the wind, the shuffle of shoes in the next room, the creak of old wood, the distant cry of a gull outside. But deep down, you'll know. It doesn't come from outside. It comes from underneath, from the layers of silence that were stacked, century after century, until they hummed with the weight of all that was buried. It is not a ghost. It is not a fable. It is the sound of a memory that refuses to die, because history doesn't vanish when we stop speaking of it. It simply waits. It waits in the stones. It waits in the walls. It waits in the breath of places that were once beautiful and terrible. And when you leave the palace, blinking in the sun, with souvenirs in hand and history in your pocket, that scream will follow. You won't hear it anymore, but you'll feel it. A thin pressure behind the ribs, a quiet ache at the base of the throat. And maybe, just maybe, you'll remember what they tried so hard to erase. That hundreds of boys were broken for beauty, that their names were stolen, that their suffering was served with wine and laughter, and that every empire, no matter how golden, stands on the bones of the voiceless. Some screams don't fade, some never stop echoing, not because they are loud, but because they were never answered.